The case began to take shape in 1998, when an 8-year-old American boy, identified only as Michael, was resuscitated after spending 14 minutes in cardiorespiratory arrest. The episode occurred in Flagstaff, Arizona, during a hot summer afternoon while neighborhood families were gathering in the community area of the apartment complex. The mother, a nurse at a local hospital, reported finding her son submerged in the community pool and immediately began full basic life support maneuvers, maintaining continuous chest compressions until the emergency team arrived. The medical reports from that night described a state of prolonged oxygen deprivation, considered consistent with severe neurological sequelae. However, the clinical outcome contradicted expectations. What started as a household accident became one of the most meticulously documented cases by the Swiss psychiatrist Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, who studied the boy in the final years of her career before her death in 2004. The notes left by the researcher, written during interviews with the family throughout 1999 and 2000, reveal the scientific rigor that marked her career. Continuous observation, precise technical language, complete absence of dramatization, and a focus on the relationship between brain function and emergent subjective content after episodes of clinical death. It was in this context that Michael's case caught her attention. In the first 48 hours after regaining consciousness, while still admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit, the boy began to verbalize memories that did not belong to his life history. Professionals assisting him recorded that, during the early morning hours of August 12, 1998, Michael murmured that he had died twice and that, before, he had been a man who drove trucks. At the time, the team interpreted the account as possible mental confusion resulting from the oxygen deprivation episode, something common in children subjected to prolonged resuscitation. However, the descriptions gained depth. In her original notes, Kübler-Ross classified the phenomenon as narrative memory not belonging to the patient's current biography. The boy not only described isolated scenes, but presented organized sequences with a beginning, middle, and end, which is uncommon in post-resuscitation disorientation. He talked about long trips on roads, a work routine involving heavy loads, constant engine noise, and a nighttime accident on a narrow road. The family stated that none of this was part of Michael's world of reference. A particularly intriguing point for the researcher was the technical knowledge demonstrated by the boy. He mentioned air pressure-activated brake mechanisms, described the use of communication radios, and cited a logistics company whose name was not part of his daily life. All this was delivered in coherent, articulated phrases and without hesitation. For Kübler-Ross, this was a rare pattern of unlearned content, an expression used in clinical studies when the patient presents information that does not match their family or social environment. Additionally, Michael reported what he described as a place without weight, where there was no body. Kübler-Ross interpreted these statements within her field of research on near-death experiences, analyzing cognitive function, emotional state, and descriptive consistency. Her goal was never to prove spiritual phenomena, but to understand how children reorganize internal content after the temporary interruption of vital functions. What emerged from that case, even in the first week, already showed a substantial clinical enigma. And the developments that followed would make Michael's story one of the most singular records compiled by the researcher. When Michael was discharged from the intensive care unit and transferred to the pediatric ward, the multidisciplinary team began to observe a pattern that caught their attention. The accounts did not diminish with clinical stabilization, as is usually the case in post-anoxic confusion. On the contrary, they became more organized. Kübler-Ross, upon reviewing the initial records sent by the local team, described the case as a rare example of post-resuscitation narrative continuity, a term used to indicate accounts that remain stable even after the recovery of neurological functions. In the following weeks, while undergoing physiotherapy and follow-up exams, Michael exhibited unusual behavior for his age. He avoided children's activities and was drawn to television programs featuring roads, mechanic workshops, and large trucks. His mother reported that he watched in silence with a concentrated expression, as if recognizing something deeply familiar. At one point, while watching a report on road transport, he stated, "That noise is the same as my truck made when I was going down the mountain pass." The family was astonished, as the boy had never had direct contact with cargo vehicles. It was during this period that Kübler-Ross began her direct interviews with Michael, following her non-invasive interview protocol. Open-ended questions, absence of suggestion, and full recording of the responses. In her notes, she described the boy as calm, oriented, and with specific vocabulary incompatible with his age. In one of the sessions, he recounted, "I was on a long road. It was night. I was carrying wood. There was a loud noise. The truck flipped over. After that, I felt like I was floating. I wasn't inside the body anymore." The researcher highlighted the physiological consistency of the response. While speaking, Michael showed an increase in heart rate and accelerated breathing, patterns common in patients accessing traumatic memories. Kübler-Ross recorded this data in parallel with neuropsychological evaluations, which showed cognitive performance within the normal range. This combination, stable memory without associated neurological damage, kept the case at a high level of clinical relevance. In subsequent visits, the boy added increasingly specific elements. He described the shape of the truck's dashboard, the smell of gasoline mixed with hot oil, the impact against the guardrail, and a final sequence that was always the same. "When I got out of there, I had no weight, just light." The accounts were objective, without symbolic or fantastical language, a characteristic emphasized by Kübler-Ross as indicative of raw memory content and not childhood imagination. Another point that impressed the team was the boy's ability to reproduce sounds associated with what he claimed was his old vehicle's engine. The phonemes Michael imitated were described by a physiotherapist as surprisingly accurate for someone without prior contact with heavy mechanics. The researcher classified this ability as a manifestation of specific unacquired auditory memory. Meanwhile, the family tried to reconcile their son's physical recovery process with the growing perplexity over the accounts. The mother, accustomed to the hospital environment, tried hard to maintain a skeptical posture. However, faced with the accumulating notes and the stability of the descriptions, she began to collaborate more intensely with the documentation, providing detailed information about Michael's behavior before and after the accident. With the accumulation of accounts, it became evident that the story narrated by the boy belonged to someone much older, someone who would have lived and died decades earlier. And as the investigation progressed, concrete details began to emerge. Details that would later allow for unexpected correspondences to be verified. As the weeks progressed, the investigation conducted by Kübler-Ross reached a decisive point. In her clinical notes, she described that Michael presented a pattern of structured episodic memories, which is rare in children subjected to prolonged resuscitation. Typically, fragmented content emerges and disappears chaotically, but with Michael the opposite happened. The accounts solidified, gaining sensory precision and temporal coherence. During one of the interviews, conducted at the family's home in Flagstaff, the boy sat at the kitchen table holding a pencil between his fingers. With careful movements, he began to draw what he claimed was the truck's dashboard. It was not a childish sketch. The tracing included the outlines of circular gauges, a sequence of indicator lights, and the exact position of the levers. The researcher noted that the boy reproduced details such as the presence of a side-handle parking brake, an item found in heavy vehicle models manufactured in the 1960s and 1970s. Upon reviewing the drawing, Kübler-Ross noted that the boy's precision was incompatible with his age or his life experience. Michael had never been in truck cabs. His family lived in a quiet residential neighborhood, and his parents worked in areas that did not involve road transport. Nothing in his daily life offered enough technical references to explain that level of detail. The researcher classified the phenomenon as unlearned technical information, a concept used in clinical investigations of atypical memory. In another session, Michael recounted a specific episode from what he claimed to be his previous existence. He described a stop at a roadside restaurant located, according to him, in a snowy place near a railway line. As he spoke, he described the smell of greasy food, the metallic sound of chairs sliding across the floor, and the distant noise of trains passing at night. Kübler-Ross observed that these elements were presented in a sensorially rich way, without embellishment or fantasy. "He speaks like someone recalling, not like someone imagining," she noted. The researcher also evaluated behavioral changes. Before the accident, Michael showed typical interests for children his age: bicycles, cartoons, simple games. Afterward, however, his behavior changed. He became more reserved, started to observe traffic with unusual attention, and showed discomfort when hearing sirens, which provoked a reaction in him described by his mother as a mix of fear and recognition. In clinical terms, Kübler-Ross considered the pattern similar to conditioned responses associated with traumatic memories, although the stated origin of the memory could not be explained by real experience in this life. Furthermore, there were the nighttime episodes. On some nights, Michael woke up reporting sensations of sudden falling, as if he were inside a vehicle losing control. He described metallic sounds, intense vibration, and sudden darkness. The researcher evaluated these episodes as possible manifestations of sensoromotor re-experiences, a phenomenon observed in patients who relive past accidents. The difference was that Michael attributed these experiences to a previous life, something the researcher treated with clinical caution, neither confirming nor denying spiritual interpretations, but recording the phenomenological consistency of the descriptions. The mother, who initially sought neurophysiological explanations, began to admit that the accounts went beyond what she could attribute to simple imagination. The father, more skeptical, participated in some interviews and showed growing discomfort as his son described scenarios and knowledge impossible for his age. For Kübler-Ross, however, the focus remained on rigorous observation and careful documentation. Understanding how such memories arose, how they were organized, and what they revealed about the child's mind after a borderline episode between life and death. At this point, the elements were already sufficient to raise the possibility that the story remembered by Michael could correspond to a real person. And in the following weeks, this hypothesis would cease to be merely a theoretical possibility. The next stage of the investigation took on a more methodical character. Although Kübler-Ross avoided any form of induction, she considered it essential to verify the existence of external correspondences that could confirm or refute the veracity of the elements narrated by Michael. In her notes, she described that she was not seeking to prove reincarnation, but to evaluate whether there was a verifiable historical correlation between the content of the declared memories and real events. The first concrete clue emerged when the boy repeatedly mentioned the name of a roadside restaurant. He pronounced the name with a typical Midwestern American accent and described it as being on a long road where snow always piled up on the sides of the lane. The detail about the snow caught attention. Arizona, where Michael lived, did not match the described setting. The researcher then analyzed the set of descriptions: heavy cargo trucks, snowy routes, narrow mountain passes, and the constant presence of wood as cargo, and concluded that the narrative seemed closer to regions in the north or northeast of the United States. In one of the interviews, Michael added a decisive piece of information. When drawing the route he claimed to travel in the other life again, he pointed with his finger to an imaginary section and said, "This is where the truck slid. It was near a big river." The researcher observed that the boy referred to a specific location, always with the same intonation, as if the point were fixed in his memory. Kübler-Ross cataloged this section as a recurrent geographical reference, a valuable element in comparative studies. Based on this data, the researchers' collaborators analyzed information available at the time about accidents involving trucks carrying wood, which occurred between the 1960s and 1970s. The objective was merely to verify if a similar case existed. The initial search revealed multiple accidents, but one stood out due to an unusual coincidence of factors. An adult male driver deceased after losing control of the truck on a snow-covered mountain road near a large river, exactly during the period cited by the boy. Meanwhile, the sessions with Michael continued. On a particularly striking afternoon, the boy described the exact moment of the accident with physiological details. He recounted the sensation of intense cold entering through the broken window, the sound of wood hitting the asphalt, and the instant when the body stopped on the outside, but the consciousness didn't stop on the inside. For Kübler-Ross, the account presented a pattern similar to that of adult patients describing memories of real trauma. Direct sensory focus, absence of metaphors, and temporal linearity. She recorded, "It does not resemble childish delirium. There is structure." Another relevant moment occurred when Michael spoke spontaneously about his old family. He cited the name of an adult woman, followed by what he claimed was the name of a boy. When asked, in a neutral tone without leading, how he knew these names, he replied, "I remember hearing her calling me from the door." The researcher noted that, until that moment, none of the names mentioned by the boy appeared in his current environment. In parallel, Michael's family observed profound emotional changes. The mother reported that her son had started to exhibit a kind of melancholy at dusk, describing a feeling that someone was waiting for me back there. This type of manifestation, although interpreted with clinical caution, reinforced the pattern of emotional coherence observed since the first week. As the documentation grew, the researcher began to organize the case into categories: sensory accounts, geographical references, specific technical knowledge, narratives of traumatic events, and mentions of previously unknown people. This classification was fundamental for the later phase, when the information obtained began to converge on a single individual. What would follow would transform Michael's case from an intriguing account into one of the most surprising ever analyzed by Kübler-Ross. The consolidation of the clinical material allowed Kübler-Ross to begin a critical stage: the systematic comparison between Michael's accounts and real cases registered in public archives. Although she herself maintained a strictly cautious posture, avoiding premature conclusions, she recognized that the quantity of consistent details justified a historical verification. In her records, she described this phase as empirical convergence analysis, a procedure adopted in studies where unusual memories need to be confronted with verifiable data. One of the central points was the supposed accident. Michael always recounted the same sequence: narrow road, accumulated snow, wood cargo secured by metal chains, loss of control on a curve, lateral impact, and partial fall over an embankment. The description included specific technical elements, such as the sound of the chains rattling against the chassis, the characteristic vibration of the axles under excess weight, and the delayed response of the brakes on icy pavement. These details were noteworthy because they corresponded to classic mechanical difficulties recorded in wood transport accidents in mountainous regions. It was in this context that the team found, among highway accident archives in the northern United States, a case that occurred in the early 1970s that presented remarkable coincidences with Michael's descriptions. It involved a professional driver killed in a fatal accident on a snow-covered road near a large river. The dynamics recorded in the official report included loss of control on the downhill section, wood cargo, and lateral overturning. Although Kübler-Ross had no way to confirm any direct link, she recorded in her notes that the elements coincided in a statistically unusual way. While the team analyzed this data, Michael continued to present spontaneous memories. In a particularly revealing session, he described an object he claimed to have carried in his pocket during his previous life, a small metal keychain with the logo of a roadside restaurant. Until then, the boy had never mentioned possessing objects in his supposed past life. The account emerged naturally while he was playing with building blocks. He stated, "I got that keychain when I stopped there at night. The woman at the counter gave it to me." The researcher recorded that the spontaneity of this type of detail reinforced the hypothesis of consolidated episodic memory. The family, initially hesitant about the continuation of the investigation, began to realize that Michael's accounts did not dissipate with time, as would be expected if they were the result of post-trauma confusion. On the contrary, they became increasingly linear. The mother reported that her son sometimes seemed divided between two affective identities, the childish one, which he was gradually resuming, and the adult one, which emerged mainly in moments of quietness or when exposed to auditory stimuli similar to those in the narrative, such as heavy engines or distant sirens. On one evening, watching the sunset on the balcony, Michael commented in a low voice, "I had to go back home, but I couldn't." The mother described this moment as one of the most emotionally disconcerting. For Kübler-Ross, this type of emotional manifestation, consistent with the content of the accounts and persistent over time, had great clinical relevance. In her records, she classified Michael's experience as emergent identity memory, a term used to describe cases where the child demonstrates not only memories, but also affective bonds associated with a previous identity. The culmination of this phase would occur when a new detail emerged, capable of directing the investigation toward a possible concrete identification of the individual described by Michael. This discovery would redefine the direction of the case. The final stage of the investigation took shape when Michael, already in an advanced process of physical recovery, revealed a piece of information he had never mentioned: a name. The scene occurred during a quiet morning while he was drawing on the kitchen table. Without anyone asking, he murmured, "I think I was called Thomas." The mother remained still, afraid of influencing him with any reaction. Kübler-Ross, upon being informed, highlighted that proper names rarely emerge spontaneously in cases of post-anoxic confusion and held high value for documentary cross-referencing. With this new data, the team directed the search to accidents involving drivers named Thomas, which occurred in mountainous regions between 1960 and 1975. The survey revealed few compatible records. One of them, however, stood out for its precision: a wood truck driver deceased in a nighttime accident on a narrow road near a large river. The report described loss of control on a curve, lateral overturning, and snowy conditions, a set of elements almost identical to those mentioned by Michael. The official record also presented an additional piece of data. The driver was the father of a young boy and lived in a small community near mountain passes and railway lines. These elements coincided with the fragments reported by the boy, especially when he described hearing a woman calling him from the door, and when he claimed to remember a boy waiting. Although Kübler-Ross maintained a neutral posture, her notes indicate that she considered the degree of convergence highly unusual from a statistical perspective. The researcher, however, never directly communicated this data to the child or the family, maintaining her methodological commitment to not influence the spontaneous content. Instead, she continued to record observable emotional and cognitive patterns. What most caught her attention in the final months was the way Michael seemed to transition between two layers of identity: the childish one, which he was gradually resuming, and the adult one, which emerged mainly in moments of quietness or when exposed to auditory stimuli similar to those in the narrative, such as heavy engines or distant sirens. In one of the last documented interviews, Michael reported a recurrent sensation he described as returning through a hole full of light. According to him, there was no body, weight, or sounds, just the impression of passing through a space where everyone seemed to know I was coming back. Kübler-Ross analyzed this excerpt within the context of studies on the threshold of consciousness in resuscitation, observing that the description was coherent with patterns reported by adults in episodes of clinical death, although adapted to childhood cognition. Throughout the final weeks of the active investigation, Michael gradually resumed age-appropriate interests and reduced the frequency of spontaneous accounts. The researcher noted that this phenomenon was common in young children. The more the current identity strengthened, the less the previous content emerged. Even so, she considered the case to remain remarkably intact, with high narrative, sensory, and technical consistency, and plausible historical comparison. Before concluding her definitive notes, Kübler-Ross recorded one final observation. This case rarely illustrates the boundary between memory, trauma, and identity. Regardless of the interpretation, the phenomenological coherence demands to be preserved and studied seriously. With this, she closed the documentation of one of the most singular cases she followed in the final years of her career. A boy who remained lifeless for 14 minutes, returned, and brought with him memories that seemed to cross the boundaries of time, biography, and the conventional understanding of human consciousness itself.